Yeah, let me just add that when I use the term, for those who aren't aware, Sherpa, well, normally it refers to the guides on Mount Everest. It is also a term used within diplomatic channels for the diplomats who have to do the actually heavy lifting. They have to write the documents. They have to negotiate out. You're going to say happy or glad or pleased. They get everything prepared so that when the principals come together, they're not caught up in a big argument over, the actual substance of the matter. It's already sort of been pre-cooked or predetermined, and none of that was done for this.
No, zero.
Yeah. So that's where they get into the first problem. The other thing is the one who's blockading now the Strait of Hormuz is the United States.
Yeah. Xi meant that.
Yeah.
Get out of the way and commerce will resume.
Yeah, because Iran has started allowing ships through, but that meet the Iranian terms. And Iran has basically said, look, if you're aligned with the United States and Israel and attacking us, okay, you're not going to come through, period. We're not going to allow that. However, if you sign up and agree to our terms, you can go through. And I think there were at least 30 ships that were allowed through yesterday. And so now, as far as global diplomacy goes, it's not Iran that's seen as holding things up. It's the United States. The other critical thing here, and I put an article up on Sonar 21 earlier this morning or late last night, depending on where you were, going through the five commodities, critical commodities that come out of the Persian Gulf that fuel the global economy. And when I say fuel, I mean they are literally essential. You can't live without them, just like as Colonel Wilkerson was talking about fertilizer. So the fertilizer that's produced is produced in part from urea and from sulfur. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
But the sulfur content is about 40% of the world's sulfur comes out of the Persian Gulf. I mean, these numbers are fantastic. And we don't appreciate that. Well, when you sit down and look at so oil, liquid natural gas, urea, sulfur, and helium. Those are the big five. The two countries in the Persian Gulf that produce actually the majority of those items are Saudi Arabia and Qatar. Kuwait, Bahrain, United Arab Emirates, they're sort of, they do a little here and there, but they're not the major players in those. And Qatar, surprisingly, it plays a major role with urea, sulfur, or LNG, urea, and helium. And the urea and LNG were they were basically destroyed when Iran took out the Ras Laffan plant. So what we're looking at here is that even if they magically open the strait, the gut punch to the global economy is just starting.
Yeah.
And China understands that, and China is well positioned to not suffer like the rest of the world is going to suffer. And that's what I don't think Trump even had a clue about.
And the other thing I would point out that the farmer in Iowa pointed out, Jimmy, was diesel's critical, and the cost of diesel is critical. And they can't go to the point that they went to, for example, a few years ago and expect to sustain themselves if diesel is as expensive as it was a few years ago. And it has every portent of being that way if we don't get the strait open.
Yeah. The other point, Carl, was the sanctions on Chinese companies, because they were somehow they're sending or receiving products from Iran and Russia. Donald Trump was talking about they sanctioned some Chinese companies before going to China. It seems the outcome of this meeting between the two presidents was that Donald Trump has decided to lift those sanctions. And the other point, Carl, is
the Chinese weren't adhering to him anyway, and they directed all of their colleagues, if you will, in the world, not to pay any attention to him also. So Trump was doing something that Xi had already done.
Yeah. Do you feel, Carl, that China, when you look at the meeting, I think something has changed. Looking at the big picture, something has changed, totally changed. China today, in my opinion, is a product. They saw what has happened in Ukraine. They saw what has happened with the case of Iranian war, or the war on Iran. And they're just thinking of their position. How did you find China's position right now? How do they define themselves? We know that the most important issue for China today is Taiwan. And they were talking about it. They were mentioning it, but we haven't heard nothing in the outcome in that statement by White House about Taiwan. It was about the Strait of Hormuz and demilitarization of the Strait of Hormuz, nothing of that sort for Taiwan. What is that, in your opinion, and how is that going to change the situation in Taiwan?
Well, ever since Deng Xiaoping, the number one talking point for any Chinese diplomat or any Chinese person in the structure, the governmental structure, whether it be a district governor or just a simple minister in the districts or up at the higher level of the Politburo, the very first talking point is Taiwan. Every time we went to China, that was the first thing that came out, whether it was Wang Yi talking to us. And at that time, he was head of the North American division in MOFA and knew more about North America than any other Chinese than Chen Chi-chen, and Chen Chi-chen passed away. So he inherited that moniker, if you will. So it's the very first thing they say. It doesn't really comport with putting enormous emphasis on it because it is pro forma with them. Now, that said, I suspect it is a little more serious right now because Xi sees the Politburo, the military structure, which Xi just changed majorly. Think about that for a minute. And I have input that tells me that was a lot about the nuclear arms race that is aborting right now and what those military people believe and what the civilians believe. But that's another matter altogether. I doubt they even talked about that. I doubt very seriously because there was no, as he said, there were no Sherpas, there was no groundwork done, there were no issues discussed. This is a very important issue, Mr. President. We should have a working group on this and we should have a position when we go in. None of that was done. Key issue, but none of that was done that I can detect. And none of those business people were there to talk about nuclear weapons, except in the sense that they might be making money off of them and might have had a side conversation about it. So what we're looking at with regard to China's position, which is your bigger question, China's position in its grandest scheme is do nothing to stop the suicide.
Yeah.
You don't necessarily have to do anything to aid and abet it, but if you have something, bring it forward and we'll talk about it. But right now, we're not in the business of aiding and abetting a clear suicide by the other power on the other end of the world that competes with us. Now, we don't want that suicide to suddenly turn into an dying elephant thrashing grass, and maybe we're in the grass. So be careful what we do. Be careful how we might decide to aid and abet this particular aspect of it. For example, the war in Iran, because it might have ramifications for us, which the war in Iran certainly does in terms of oil and other things. So that's China's geostrategic position. Let them kill themselves. At the same time, you've got other people in the Central Party School who are advising, and generally that advice gets up to the Politburo, and it has some impact, that you don't want them gone completely from the world because they benefit you by being in the world in a number of ways, tick, 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 tick. So if you can develop diplomacy that keeps those aspects of the empire from disappearing and keeps them either negative, neutral, or in your favor, do that too. So he has a very exquisite portfolio that he can choose from at any given time in terms of actions China will take vis-a-vis America and in general vis-a-vis the West, which he considers Europe in particular, Western Europe in particular, Eastern Europe. I think he's kind of got real substantive questions about, as do I and anybody looking at it. Are the Poles going to take over for Germany? Are you kidding me? That's what their government's talking about right now. Send your troops to our country. We'll take over from Germany. Well, Poland, what are the two countries in the world you have had in the last few hundred years the most problems with? Moscow and Berlin. Okay, well, maybe that's not a smart move. So Xi's kind of puzzled about that, but he's not puzzled about Western Europe. Western Europe is essentially, for different reasons, the same state that America's in. So he's got a similar strategy towards that. Doesn't want to lose them, and certainly doesn't want to lose the aspect that Putin is talking to him about all the time, restoring Russian sales of LNG and oil to Europe, which is happening right now. It's happening right now, even though the EU has passed laws about it not happening. And so he's got a very exquisite view of what's happening in the world. And he's got a strategy, multiple strategies for dealing with it. And this meeting was no disturbance of that. Not really. Just confirmed for him what he already thinks he knows, and probably rightfully.
You know, and the language he used was particularly striking. You know, when he brought up the Thucydides trap, I bet Trump was going, huh?
Who's that? What's that?
Yeah. What kind of trap? You know, now, and I admit, you know, I had to go back and I said, you know, I was familiar with the term, but if you'd asked me to stand up and give a definition, I couldn't have given a definition offhand. Okay. So either we're looking at, you know, Xi Jinping as one of the most intelligent, educated leaders, you know, well-versed in ancient Greek history, or this, you know, one of his clever underlings said, hey, boss, let's lay this on Trump. This will freak him out. You know, I'm not sure which it was, but it was one of the two. And, you know, Chinese were sending a very strong signal that they are the rising power. In fact, I think on many, if you want to pick a number of variables, you could point out that China has now surpassed the United States. They have more banks in the top 10 of the world banks. They have a higher literacy rate than the United States. They have certainly a higher industrial capability. They can build more ships in 1 year than we built in, you know, the last 60. They've developed hypersonic missiles that are, you know, 4, and we haven't even deployed 1. So, you know, we just keep going down the list. And, you know, I think they also know from history that this kind of displacement of a hegemon, displacement of the United States as, quote, who perceives itself as we're the world leader, we're the best, we're the strongest. And nope, you know, that it's like with Snow White, where the evil queen's mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of them all? And the day comes up, the mirror looks back and says, you ain't it. You know, your time is over.
And what Larry's talking about is so true. One of the most difficult things in human history, the 3,000 years we know something about and the 5,000 we know a little bit about, is this kind of transition, which is what Graham Allison and the Thucydides trap, and General Thucydides himself, he was a general. A lot of people forget that, as well as a historian, one of the first historians in the world. Part of their point is just this. It is one of the most difficult transitions, most often failed at rather than succeeded, out of empire, out of the grand power, out of the scheme of, you know, I'm the hegemon, I'm the number one power in the world. And it's not going to be any different for America. In fact, in some respects, it's going to be more difficult because we have an incredible capacity to not be cohesive. 50 states, increasingly with different views, different visions, different kinds of problems, but some common problems that adhere, one of which is AI and water use and power. And it's coming into me email after email after email about the problems we're developing with this. Places like Corpus Christi, Texas, which have no water. which are going to disappear if we can't do something about their water problem. All of this is creating some real turmoil. So add to the fact that this is an extremely challenging moment for anyone in human history to navigate successfully, stepping down from empire. And by the way, Britain, when it stepped down, simply stepped into the shadow of America. So it had some place to go to hide, as it were. We don't have any place to go to hide. And we have a potential for dismemberment of our country, period, that's hugely potent right now, particularly with this administration, who would take total advantage of that probably to create their own kind of government in its wake. That's extremely destabilizing and dangerous, I think. And we're at a moment right now in history, our history in particular, that's going to be difficult to navigate. And Xi knows that. Xi knows that. He doesn't want it to be catastrophic, but he wants it to proceed apace.
Yeah. He said that, Larry, he said that you have to choose. You want to confront, we can confront. You want to cooperate, we are ready to cooperate. And this is, I think, one of the main messages from China. We know that the Iranian foreign minister went to China before this meeting between Donald Trump and Xi. And next Wednesday, we're going to have Russian President Vladimir Putin going to China and talking with him. Larry, how do you see that the way that China, Russia, and Iran are solidifying or improving the sort of partnership they have to confront these sort of policies on the part of Washington to influence their countries?
Well, there's something big underway behind the scenes that it's not in public. I have received this information from, I'll call it a source with access to Pakistan's intelligence service. The comments that both Putin and Wang Yi made after meeting in Karachi regarding a new security architecture for the Gulf were not just offhand remarks. There is an actual planning effort, negotiation effort underway, and it is concentrated on Qatar and Saudi Arabia. And part of the reason Pakistan's playing a leading role in this, with the encouragement and if not the direction of China, is that Pakistan has a bilateral security treaty with the Saudis. So, and the reason they're focused on Saudi Arabia and Qatar, as I mentioned earlier, those two countries produce, helium and sulfur and urea and liquid natural gas. I mean, Qatar was accounted for 10% of the global supply of liquid natural gas. Think about that. It was the fourth largest after, had Russia, United States, Norway, and then I think Qatar. So, it's not insignificant. And the entire idea behind this new security architecture is to expel the U.S. military presence from the Persian Gulf, because the only reason it's there is to attack Iran. So get that out of there, to create an incentive for both the Saudis and the Qataris to distance themselves from the United States. Because in the past, part of that relationship of having the security blanket of Uncle Sam was you also had to buy Uncle Sam's treasury bills, and you had to buy Uncle Sam's, shitty military equipment. Well, now that's starting to go away. And so Iran Iran's not just a passive observer in this. Iran is directly involved in coordinating with both China and Russia, and China is playing a major role here. And that's why I think Trump sought to get the Chinese intervention. Help us get those Iranians under control. And China's basic word was no. It is, you're the problem, not them, which is, shocking for someone like Donald Trump. So this is, it's not, they're not announcing this. It's not, but this is happening behind the scenes. And I think this is terribly, terribly significant.
Larry, is that related to this sort of news that came out about non-aggression pact between, Because they're talking about a new pact between Iran and Arab states.
Yes.
Basically,
yes.
Saudi Arabia and Qatar.
Oh,
It's
yeah.
called
Absolutely.
non-aggression pact.
Absolutely.
And one thing, just to reinforce what Larry said, I have it on fairly good authority that Netanyahu had a trip planned to Islamabad. But what's happening right now has delayed that. But I'm quite confident that one of the things he wants to do is start a, diplomatic action and otherwise to counter some of this, because he sees it as being counter to his interest, as well he should. His political turmoil right now, though, is deepening every moment. I don't know what's going to happen. The vote of no confidence procedure in the Knesset is very different. And I think what he's done is forestall a precipitate vote of no confidence by simply going for the bigger one, which puts it out to almost when an election would be anyway. So he feels like that he's got the time to regain lost ground and such. And frankly, there's no one in the opposition who looks like they're any better than Netanyahu. And that's got voters probably puzzled as to whom they might vote for. But he's concerned about what's happening. There's no way he doesn't know about what Larry just said.
Yeah.
Colonel, here is what Donald Trump said about the reason of the war on Iran.
We don't.
Sean Hannity's leading the person he's interviewing is so obvious. I think he must have got lawyer training.
Yeah. Colonel, what he said about the reasons for the war is about Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar. I don't see that happening in Saudi Arabia and Qatar. They don't see this war as though helping them in any aspect.
Exactly the opposite.
They see how this war is hitting them, is destroying their countries, their economy.
Exactly the opposite. You're perfectly right there. We forget, some people do anyway, that China was a very vested party to the JCPOA. And China showed during that time, through its negotiating and through its diplomacy, that it was indeed concerned about another violation of the Non-Proliferation Treaty and another nuclear power. And it was convinced that the diplomacy that was going to take place with the Europeans and with us and others was going to be successful and would be good, because they didn't want another nuclear power in the world. I don't think any of the vested nuclear powers want other nuclear powers in the world. Not really. In fact, I would say that the better amongst them want the numbers to go down, not up, but at best, or at worst, to stay stable. So China was all for that. But China has seen what has morphed out of that with Donald Trump in particular, and Joe Biden, I can't let him out of this bag either, since that JCPOA. And Biden was an enemy of the JCPOA because Blinken and Sullivan, his right-hand men as vice president, were an enemy of the JCPOA. They dared not let Obama get any sign of it, but they were. And they showed their true colors as soon as they came out, just like they did toward Cuba. Rapprochement achieved, positive relations developing, they killed it. They murdered it in its crib. So a lot of the blame goes back to Biden, not only for that, but for Ukraine and a host of other things that we did very badly in his time, mostly due to Blinken and Sullivan. I don't know if Biden was even sentient at the time. So you've got a situation now where China has changed completely because of what we've done. I'm not saying they're in favor of Iran getting a nuclear weapon. I don't think they are. Just as I said, in general, they're not in favor of that. But they have changed because we have forced them to change. And this is one of those things that I was talking about that Xi has told people to watch very carefully. Because if there is something the United States is doing that is disturbing our march toward championship, we want to do something about it. And that's where he is now. And he is doing something about it as best he can.
Yeah. Larry, when it comes to the Iranian nuclear program, it didn't seem that China didn't respond to that comments of Donald Trump. But we know that Iran doesn't want nuclear weapon. It is not something new to announce that let's condemn Iran pursuing nuclear weapons. They don't want it. That's why they were negotiating with the United States before this war started.
Yeah, well, look, number one, I would ask anyone that has not read the JCPOA, that agreement that was inked with Iran, please go read it, because the amount of propaganda that's put out about it is just it's absurd, because you realize it was a robust agreement. Now, one of the propaganda lines in the West is that, oh, Obama gave all these billions of dollars to Iran. Well, number one,
their money.
Yeah, it was their money. They had paid to U.S. arms dealers money that was, this was when the Shah was in power. So Iran had purchased weapons that were to be delivered to Iran. And then once the Shah went away, the United States, we're just going to keep the damn money. Well, the courts then decided, no, you can't do that. But the United States has continued to hold it. But the other thing to recognize is when that JCPOA was signed, both China and Russia at the time agreed to enforce pretty onerous sanctions on Iran if it didn't comply. And this is what makes it even more astonishing how stupid Donald Trump was in abrogating and tearing up that agreement. Because if the goal really was to prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon, that did it. But again, as I've argued before, the whole issue about Iran getting a nuke, that's just a sideshow. It's just an excuse to go in and to try to find a reason to destroy the Iranian government. Because when you explain to people that at least within Shia theology, the Shia are very consistent in that it is a sin to kill non-combatants. It's okay, guys carrying guns and shooting back at you, you can kill them, that's okay. But you don't kill women and children, you don't slaughter innocents. And it's quite different from the Wahhabi and the Deobandi philosophy. And that's why that's one of the principal reasons behind the Ayatollah Khamenei's fatwa against a nuclear weapon. Because a nuclear weapon is an indiscriminate weapon that kills innocents. And that's why it's a sin. And so you got to applaud the Iranian Islamic Republic for at least having some shred of humanity that Israel and the United States clearly do not. So the fact that China's presented, you want to help us keep Iran from getting a nuclear weapon? Yeah, sure, because they're not trying to get one. I'm sure China has that assurance so far from Iran, and that's why, while for those who are in, of a Hollywood movie mentality, get the nuke and that'll put you on even keel. The fact of the matter is, Iran, with its conventional weapons, conventional ballistic missiles, is proven a formidable foe that has defeated a world superpower and one of the leading militaries, if not considered the most powerful military in the Middle East. Iran stopped them. And that has, the rest of the world is watching going, how about that? Maybe the West is not as tough as we thought they were.
Yeah.
Nima, this is the one place where I will take exception to what Larry just said. I don't think we have what we had with the Ayatollah. I think what we have right now is a very, very rational military force, the IRGC, in charge of Iran for all intents and purposes. And I think what they have concluded, despite some of their Islamic leanings, if you will, which Larry elaborated on, and I agree with that to this point, I think they have a undisclosed facility deep underground, and I think they are very capable of now making a warhead, matching it with one of their faster missiles, and somehow, as the North Koreans did, announcing it. How they'll do that, I'm not quite sure. But I'll remind everybody that China was deadly opposed to all the Kims, Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-il, and Kim Jong-un, getting a nuclear weapon. They were our most potent ally. And Russia was right behind them at the time. I dare say they aren't anymore, at trying to talk Pyongyang out of a nuclear weapon. More potent than we were in many respects, which is why we continually hosted the six-party talks in Beijing. One of the reasons, anyway. I think that whole thing has broken down now, and it's broken down with China and Russia also with regard to Iran becoming a nuclear power, because they understand, I think, that at heart, the only reason they're going to want this is a deterrent. They don't want to use it on anybody, but they want a deterrent. And the world has demonstrated to them, primarily through the DPRK experience, that if you get, and Gaddafi experience, he's dead now and his country's in turmoil. North Korea is, the dynasty is fine, and North Korea is, in their respect, fine. And it's all in their minds due to the possession of a nuclear weapon. I don't think they have any intent of using it. I really don't. And increasingly, the South has been being kind of talked out of its trajectory toward perhaps having one, partly by that. And there are talks going on between Pyongyang and Seoul. So I disagree there that they might find it convenient, even part of their survival, to have one in that still very dangerous region.
Yeah. I mean, that's I don't necessarily disagree with the good colonel, because you can come up with a very rational argument why they now say, hey, look, we've tried to play it the Western way, and they keep betraying us repeatedly, and so the only way we're going to have guaranteed safety is, we're going to have to build our own and let them know. But again, I come back to the whole nuclear issue. I call it a red herring, because let's assume that the nuclear issue is off the table. The West still wants to destroy the Islamic Republic. Yeah. So it doesn't matter what Iran does. This is because, remember, when we were backing Saddam in 1980, 81 through 88, and that whole war that was waged against Iran wasn't looking for a nuke back then. That nuke had nothing to do with it. We hate the concept of an Islamic Republic.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right there.
I can confirm that there are
Israel. You got to think about Israel in this too. Netanyahu is just such a freaking maniac. I have no doubt that he would use a nuclear weapon, and I'm sure they feel the same way in Tehran.
Exactly, Larry. That's the main critical discussion right now in Tehran among the high-rank people about what are they going to do with Benjamin Netanyahu and Israel if they decide to do something against Iran with nuclear weapons, if they decide to attack Iran each and every 2 months, each and every 6 months. What would be the response from Iran, and how they can reduce that sort of threat? Just remember what has happened so far with the war against Iran. They have destroyed many infrastructure in Iran. They killed many people, innocent people, civilians. They don't want to get back to this sort of situation they're in right now. That's the huge question on their part. What are we going to do with that?
And as I understand Brad Cooper's testimony to the Congress that wasn't necessarily open, we're planning on, if we do it, we're planning on being as destructive as several nuclear weapons would be on Iran in this next riposte if we execute it. So, I mean, you really have lots of incentive there. I wouldn't, as a military person in particular, but as a human being, I wouldn't blame them at all.
Mm-hmm.
Here is, Larry, what Donald Trump said about the little cleanup that he has to do about Iran.
Yes.
Yeah. What does that mean? Literally, in Iran, they say there is no difference right now between the president of the United States and Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister of Israel.
Correct.
They're two merged into each other. They're basically the same sort of policies and the same sort of mindset.
unless we see an order given throughout CENTCOM to start withdrawing assets from theater, then I assure you that the United States will renew an attack on Iran. And this next round, while the while Trump, again, in his delusion, we've destroyed their military capability. Well, if you have, then why isn't the Strait of Hormuz open? Huh? If you've really wiped it out, if all their ships are at the bottom of the sea, then what is there left to punch back with? And Trump, in one of his recent social posts, accusing anybody who suggests that Iran's missile force is largely intact is a traitor and guilty of treason. Yeah. Just crazy talk. So Trump's going to have to learn the hard way. If he authorizes new strikes, which I believe he will, the Iranian retaliation will be far more devastating to the United States. Now, the wild card here is, what are Qatar and Saudi Arabia going to do? Because this will be what they call the nut cutting moment. Mm-hmm. That if they allow the United States to use their facilities, in Qatar it's Al Udeid. I mean, that is still the largest base throughout the Middle East, and then the Saudis with Prince Saud Air Base. I was just actually yesterday, one of my neighbors, he's a pilot, and I got talking to him, and he mentioned that his son was over in Saudi Arabia. I said, "What is he?" He goes, "Oh, he's Air Force. He's flying KC-135s." And I went, "Jesus, man." Yeah. So they don't have protection. He goes, "I know." And he says, "The only good news," he says, "my son gets to come back next week for his wife is having their first child. And so he got leave to do that." I said, "Good." But all of our guys that are over there right now, they need to get the hell out, be pulled out. But the question remains, will the Saudis allow the United States to continue to conduct air operations? If the Saudis and Qataris shut that down, then that's going to make the United States pause. That's one of these other wild cards, that even though Trump wants to give the order, Admiral Cooper is going to have to come back and say, "Hey, boss, we don't have the access to Qatar and Saudi Arabia that we did before." And I guarantee you, if the Saudis and Qataris aren't on board, Kuwait's not going to stick its neck out. It's going to say, "Oh yeah, and so all of a sudden the United States is going to be faced with not having the basis to launch the refueling aircraft. And understand that I think they're keeping like the F-35s farther to the west in Jordan at the Muwafaq al-Salti Air Base. So if they fly to, if they're going to fly to drop ordnance on Iran, the distance from al-Muwafaq Air Base to Riyadh is over 800 miles. Mm. The combat radius of an F-35, as I understand it, is like 550 miles. So that means they got to be refueled before they even get to a point in Riyadh where they could potentially launch a JASSM. A JASSM has a range of about 500 miles. So, and then they have to immediately turn around and get refueled again. So, I mean, this is what we're talking is if you're going, and the plan is for 500 targets. If you're going after 500 targets, you got 500 aircraft in the air, or at least more than 100 or 200. And if you got to do refueling for 200 aircraft, I mean, this thing gets enormously complex. So that's where, in a way, the Saudis and Qataris, I think they hold the key to whether or not the United States will actually be able to renew this offensive. They want to, but then you get down to the practical nuts and bolts of the logistics. Do they have the logistics that can actually support it?
There was an article in Haaretz the other day too, Nima, that was interesting from the point of view that newspaper was reporting it, but it was reporting it from a different angle than Larry was just discussing, which is an important angle militarily. It was saying the Israeli IDF, AF, is really angry with the United States because of all the space they're taking on their airfields.
And basically in Ben Gurion, they have just a lot of C-130 and other airplanes in Ben Gurion Airport. And Larry, when it comes to Saudi Arabia, we have a report on Bloomberg reporting that during the recent war, the war between Iran and the United States, UAE leader MBZ, Mohammed bin Zayed, personally called leaders of Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia, proposing to form an Arab coalition against Iran, but every country refused. This report on Bloomberg.
Yeah.
How do you find that? We are two sort of arguments. On one side, we are hearing that Saudi Arabia was trying to convince the United States to continue the war. On the other hand, we are hearing from Saudi Arabia that this war has to end. We have to find other solution because our economy is just in a bad shape right now, and we cannot make money.
Yeah, well, that is the key thing to look at in terms of the disruption of the flow of those, 5 commodities I talked about earlier: oil, liquid natural gas, urea, helium, sulfur. When you look at the overall within the scope of the Gulf Arabs, the oil flow is most critical for the Saudis. They're sort of their major income stream is from the export of oil and the export of sulfur. For Qatar, their major income stream is from the liquid natural gas, the urea, and the helium. And they also pump some oil. Everybody else is also primarily dependent on oil that's getting exported, and so it's not getting exported, so they don't have the cash flow. So they are looking to get that whole process back in line, back online, so that they do have some cash flow. And this is where the UAE is now in a bit of trouble, because before they still had Fujairah port, which was on the Gulf of Oman. So it was considered outside of the Strait of Hormuz, and was not easy for Iran to block it. Well, Iran blew it up. And now they don't have that anymore. So their cash flow is cut off. And this is, I feel like the voice crying in the wilderness with respect to the economic implications of the shutdown of this place. Now we're approaching 80 days.
Yep.
And it is the global impact on the shortages is significant. Just as an example, here in the United States, it was Shell and Mobil Oil informed Costco and Walmart. So the two big, these are big stores which sell cut rate items. They said, all that oil we give you or we sell you, that you put on your shelves for people to do their own oil change in their vehicles, we don't have anymore. So those shelves are now going to be empty. The Toyota issued a bulletin to its U.S. distributors that, hey, usually they use like 8-weight oil for oil change. They're now saying, well, you can use 16-weight or 20-weight because we don't have any more of the 8-weight, and the other is going to be scarce too. So this is, starting now to hit.
Watch out! I'm getting an oil change next week.
Yeah, get it while you can, my friend. Get it while you can. So this cascade effect is starting, and it is significant. And that's the problem is it's not until the full rage of this economic punch in the gut becomes so apparent that Trump is actually going to have to cave. And we saw Trump just before he got on the plane, when he was asked about the economic circumstances for Americans, he basically said, I don't care, not my problem. Well, it's going to become his problem. You watch. In fact, today, during this whole China trip, the stock market had soared up to over 50,000 again. It's dropped now about 500 points at the Dow Jones. It's down on the NASDAQ as well, and the S&P. It's so starting to fall. And the realities of the supply shortages are going to start hitting. They're hitting this week. It's going to be worse next week. It's going to be worse the week after.
Yeah, there is a report, Colonel, in the Financial Times. It says that if the Strait of Hormuz remains heavily disrupted into next month, the issue shifts from high prices to actual physical shortages. And this is the reality of Donald Trump. I don't know how is he gonna. He said that he rejected the Iranian proposal. Here is what he said about the Iranian proposal.